Hello and good morning. It is so great to see you this morning. We're thankful to be able to worship God and thankful that you're here for that purpose. We're thankful to assemble any time to worship, but especially we're thankful for today to begin our week at the foot of the throne of God. We do want to say thank you for a great Sunday last week with a great crowd for worship, even a great crowd at 1 o'clock worship. We're so thankful for that, and a great lunch, such great food and participation in that. And we're so thankful for all of those things that we do. We look forward to continuing to grow together through those opportunities. And just on behalf of our family, we do thank you for your generosity and your kindness toward us this year. We appreciate you so much. I don't know of a more blessed preacher in terms of who he gets to work with than us and than me. And so we're so thankful for you. And we feel like we have such a good end, the better end of this relationship. We appreciate you so much. We're going to be in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 in just a moment. Romans chapter 12, if you want to be turning to that text in your New Testament. Augustus Caesar is considered the first official emperor of the Roman Empire. His adopted father, Julius Caesar, made some strides to consolidate things into an empire, but really, technically, Augustus is the first. And he reigned for over 40 years. It kind of coincided with, but he also was able to be a part of this bringing of peace, where there was very little military fighting and ongoing battles in terms of the war or the world landscape. And so they were the dominant empire, but they brought peace in being that empire. And so it's called Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And he was largely responsible for that. Right before he began to reign, up in northern Italy, they discovered in Carrara a vast marble mine. And so as you see the kingdom growing into this wealth of economic success, you also find the discovery of this marble that lasts. You go to Rome, you see just marble statues everywhere and marble structures and columns, because it's one of the things that began to be leveraged for their opulence. And so Suetonius, the Roman historian, quotes Augustus as having said this: "I found Rome built of brick and left her clothed in marble." I found her pretty homely, just pretty good, but I left her exquisite. I clothed her in marble. Now, as supreme leaders are known to do, he's probably exaggerating quite a bit there. But just think for a moment. If a Caesar can turn brick into marble, how much more can our God do in transforming us? And likewise in transforming us, showing us the power to transform even our homes. Our aim for the rest of the year, these last 3 lessons, is to consider what it would look like when our lives are full of the love of God. Our theme for the year has been fulfilled, full of His love, and Romans chapter 12 is all about the love of God seen in our relationships in the church. And so what we want to do is take the principles of love and the principles of being Christians in Him and move that toward applying them to our homes. See, we think about our homes this time of year, our physical houses, and we think about decorations. We transform them, we might say, by hanging garland or by setting up trees or lights or other decorations. Well, that's good, but is that a full transformation? We might even think about updating decorations throughout the year, or furniture or wallpaper or paint, and we talk about remodels and redecorations. That's good, but is that fully what God has in mind for the Christian? See, Romans chapter 12 opens with a key verb of transformed. And so what happens when we submit fully to God is we are transformed by Him. And what that also means is then every relationship we are a part of experiences that transformation as well. When we think specifically about our homes, we think about how they bear marks of the one who built it. Some of these neighborhoods that are popping up, subdivisions that are popping up in Jasper, and you see it all over the country, of course, and so often they're contracted out to the same builders. So you have dozens of houses or hundreds of houses, and they're all being built by the same people. Well, they're going to look a lot like each other. They're going to have a lot of the same characteristics. But even other ways, you see similar things happening even when they don't always look the same. Our street, for example, there are 11 houses on that street, and 9 of the 11 were built by the same father and son. Well, they don't look the same. Some have brick, some have siding, some are 1 story, some are 2 story. Some have basements, some don't have basements. But you get to the inner workings and how the wood is joined together, how it's wired, how it's plumbed. There are going to be some characteristics that all of those houses bear together because they have the same builder. So when we think about our homes, Christian homes, they're going to look different in terms of interest, in terms of personalities, in terms of strengths. And yet they're all going to bear the same marks of the builder who is Christ. And just as he has built his church, he shows us how to build homes that please him. I decided to do this study over a year ago, back October of 2021, and decided to put it on the calendar here in December because of just how difficult this time of year can be within our homes. Not only are we running around and our schedules are maxed out, and so that often increases stress and exhaustion, but it's a difficult time when we've had loss in our homes, death of loved ones, whether it's the first holiday season without them or whether it's the 10th or the 20th. Those holidays are difficult without the people that we love if they've gone on to the life after this one. But also just knowing the relational struggles that family often includes and involves. The holiday season can intensify those emotions. And so what we learn is that it's a good time of year, this season is, to not run away from the home, to not run away from these things, but instead to turn toward God so that he can help us and will help us through the course of studying his word to improve and especially transform our homes by his love. So let's dive into Romans chapter 12. We're going to use verses 1 and 2 as a springboard not only for this morning, but also for the next 3 weeks. And so it's about half of this morning's lesson, but it's also introducing just 3 key words that will help us over the next couple of lessons also. So Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse number 1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship or your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So what are 3 key words we can lock in on that will help us this morning in the next couple of weeks? Number 1, notice the key word upward. We need to see this necessity of an upward focus. How does Paul appeal to us? He begs us, he entreats us, commands us by the mercies of God. He's orienting us upward. Now, in a way, we could say what he means by the mercies of God are the previous 11 chapters. And so if we're not familiar with the book of Romans, or if it's been a little while since you've read it, and you're sitting here wondering, well, what does he mean by the mercies of God? Let me challenge you this afternoon or tonight or tomorrow, read through Romans chapter 1 through the end of chapter 11. You won't understand it all because it's difficult to chew on. But there's so much that is deep. He just finishes chapter 11 by talking about the depths of the riches, the knowledge of God. Now he's saying, by those mercies that are unsearchable, I'm pointing you on how then to act and respond and to keep responding. So God's mercies are simultaneously the reason for, they're our obligation, they're our ought to, and they are also our motivation. They are why we choose to, why we want to. Talks about those mercies back in chapter 3. There's a pivot point in chapter 3, really almost between verses 23 and 24. Verse 24 says, all are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. God turns toward us and offers us his grace, his salvation, his mercies through Jesus Christ, and he tells us how to receive that gift. So as we think about the mercies of God, we think about our homes especially, where is the place that we hear and talk about the mercies of God the most? Where's the physical location where we hear the mercies of God talked about, and we also do the talking about the mercies of God the most? Is it here? Is it 584 New Oakland Highway? Or is it where we live? Now consider the time spent at our homes versus and living amongst the home, our people. Now consider our time there and our time here. And if we struggle with this question, do we need to continue with the lesson? Right? Where do we hear the most about the mercies of God? God wills that we talk about and hear about and study about and draw from and live from His mercies everywhere we are and go. And so our homes should be a seat, a focus of the mercies of God, an upward focus. But second key word is inward. He says, I appeal to you by the mercies of God that you offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. It's the understood you in verse number 2. You don't be conformed by this world, but instead you be transformed by the renewal of your mind. We're going to have an upward focus in this study, but we're also going to have an inward responsibility. We recognize He's telling us you have a choice. You can only control you. I can only control me. So much of our dysfunction and struggles result from a misunderstanding of control and responsibility. This whole chapter of Romans chapter 12 emphasizes how love looks when it's lived out amongst one another. And you'll never see him say, well, just control other people so that you can get what you want and have the outcomes you think you want. It's instead all about how to submit fully to the will of God and to show His courageous love. If we're going to improve and transform our lives, if we're going to transform our homes, it's not going to come because we sit around and wait for someone else to do something. It's going to be because we accept the responsibility God gives us. And so 2 things that I try to tell virtually any person who comes and sits down with me in a counseling type situation, whether it's an individual, whether it's a couple that's coming for, say, pre-marriage counseling, or maybe it's a couple that's struggling in their marriage. I start in the first session by referencing 2 key things, honesty and responsibility. That no matter how big the hurdle and big the conflict, if we're all 100% honest and 100% responsible, we can address those conflicts. We can work through them God's way. But if we're not honest and we're not responsible, even the smallest, seemingly most insignificant sources of conflict will take us down. So Paul is saying, you want to be the people of God, the person of God who is also the people of God in the church. It demands you looking inwardly. And so a series on the home that we're undertaking here is not about everybody else, it's about me. It's about how I can respond the way God would have me to respond. But then the third direction we need is a forward direction. Be transformed. He said, don't be conformed in such that you're hardened from the outside by the world, but instead keep being renewed inwardly, transformed and changed. He's got a forward view to this. Don't be satisfied and settled where you're at, but instead think ahead. Where are we headed? Where am I headed? Just think about that from a personal level. Where am I headed if I continue to do basically what I'm doing right now, what I've been doing of late? Where are we headed as a home, as a family, as parents to children, as husbands and wives? Where are we headed if things more or less continue with how they are now? That's the thinking of transformation. And so what the positive spin on that is when we're renewed in our minds by seeking the will of God and knowing the will of God and submitting our lives to Him by giving ourselves as these living sacrifices, then we have the promise of the future, of a hope and growth and stability and pleasing Him. Some of our deepest hurts come from family and come from within the home, and that's certainly the case when sin and dysfunction enters. And the devil loves to focus on those things. He loves for us to focus and to place our attention there on the past. Whether we caused them or whether someone else did, he wants us to keep thinking and reliving those things. What God promises is the path of transformation. We can turn those painful moments and turn those regrets over to God, process them healthily through Him, and then navigate the future grounded in Him. And we have the promise that when we do that, what do we see? We see that we're holy and acceptable to God. And that we get to live out the will of God that's good and acceptable and perfect. It's complete. It's going to address all of our lives. And so we think forward because we first sought God. We decide to take personal responsibility, and then we move forward instead of getting grounded and anchored too much to the pain of the past. So a summary of the series and the summary of these first two verses for our purposes is that when we live from the mercies of God, we now have everything we need to transform, first ourselves, but then extending from that, our homes and our families. So in thinking of that base moving forward, now let's turn to verse number 3 and see this first paragraph and how that helps us in this regard. So Romans chapter 12, beginning of verse number 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each measure of the faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Our key phrase comes from verse number 3. Because he says not to think more highly than we ought to think, what does that mean? There is a way in which we ought to think. If we're going to have the love of God in our lives and thus see that in our homes, it's going to begin when we think how we ought to think, which is with sober judgment. So first, how we think about ourselves in terms of identity. Think is a key word throughout Romans. The mind, the focus on the mind is a key word in terms of how we put these things into practice. And you'll notice back in chapters 6 through 8, he's told us how we should think about ourselves. So don't think too highly more than you ought to think. Well, you pull that phrase out and you see, well, there's some times he says how you ought to think about yourself. And in chapter 6 through 8, there are 5 things he says you should keep thinking about yourself. These are things and changes that God has made when you submitted your life to him, when you were baptized into him, Romans 6, 3 and 4. Here are the changes God makes. So think of yourself in these terms. You're dead and resurrected. You're no longer answerable to sin. You've overcome sin. You have an old life and a new life. So consider yourself dead to sin and resurrected, raised to a new life. We're also to consider ourselves and think of ourselves as instruments for God's righteousness, as enslaved to God's righteousness, as being adopted, chosen, special by God as his children, as being more than a conqueror to the love of Christ. We're going to think soberly and think with sound judgment, he says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. It begins by having an awareness and a constant grounding in who he's made us to be. Here's how we ought to think. Now just think about how all of our relationships would benefit from us always thinking, here's my relationship to God. It dictates how I live. But specifically the text, what does he mean by sober judgment? Here's how you ought to think. You ought to think with sober judgment, sound judgment. Well, first in the context, and we'll see this a little bit more, but he's saying you each have different gifts assigned, so think soberly about that in relation to how you're all brought together in one in the body. You're all different, but you all have one place in his church. Now, those gifts have ceased. The miraculous aspect of those has ceased. But it's still true that we each are individuals, and yet we're all brought together in the church. And so the Christian should think not too highly, but also think and recognize, I've got a place. And my brother and my sister and the church have a place. And we all are one. Now notice how this is a theme he's revisiting from several places prior to this in Romans. That word think in chapter 12 and verse 3 is used 4 times in that one verse alone. Don't think too highly as he ought to think, but instead think with sound thinking, sound judgment. So 4 times he uses it in that one verse, and he's been weaving that in the text prior to getting here. One of those times is Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse number 5. For those who live according to the Spirit, those who live according to the flesh, set their minds, there's the word, set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Well, how do you know the difference? What's the outcome of those who are constantly dwelling on and thinking on the things of the flesh compared to those who dwell on and think about the things of the Spirit? Look at verse number 6. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. So what does God want in our lives? He wants us to have life and peace. Therefore, he makes himself available to keep thinking on and being renewed in our minds. And thus it leads to life and peace. But then there's another usage of it in Romans chapter 11, verse number 20. And I almost think chapter 12, verse 3 is shorthand for what he's described in chapter 11, verse 20. because it's there he uses a longer Greek phrase to say, do not become proud. Do not become arrogant. And he's talking directly to Gentile Christians because he's made this argument. The Jews were the people of God for a physical purpose, to bring the Savior of the world into the world. But they have rejected God spiritually, so they've fallen away. Corporately, the Jews as a nation don't know God. There are some Jewish Christians, but now the Gentiles, you've been welcomed as the people of God. But then he turns around and he says, but you better not get arrogant about it. You better not think highly, exaltedly about yourself. Because just as they fell away, you could fall away. And just as you have come to obey, they can come once again to decide to obey. And so he's saying, your harmony as Gentile is dependent upon you not thinking too highly of yourselves. And if you begin the book, you read chapters 1 through 3, you see every reason why we should never think too highly of ourselves. The first 3 chapters, almost the first whole 3 chapters, it changes gears at the end of chapter 3. It's all about how Jew and Gentile alike are deserving of the wrath of God because of sin. So that's why he brings it to a head in chapter 3 and verse 22 and 23. For there's no distinction, for all have sinned, and all fall short of the glory of God. So you can't think too highly of yourself and say, well, I'm better because I'm this or that, because, listen, you've all been lost. And if you're saved, you're all saved because of God's grace through Jesus Christ. And so now he pulls that into chapter 12 and says, if you're going to be this living sacrifice, if you're going to be transformed, you're going to see that in the body of the church by not thinking too highly, but instead thinking with sound, sober judgment. Now, what does Paul talk about in chapter 4 of Philippians? Third reference of this word. He uses it twice to say, your concern has been revived for me. You have revived your concern toward me. So he's in prison, and they wanted to send him a gift. They wanted to come visit, but logistically they couldn't make it work. Well, where was their mind? They had not forgotten Paul, even though they had not been able to send a physical gift. He was saying, your mind was dwelling on me. Your mind was concerned and focused on me. Well, likewise, what he's saying is, you need to think with concerned thinking, concerned about the right things thinking, concerned about the will of God, and in this passage, concerned about the whole of Christ. Concerned about how you get along with and you work with and you recognize the importance of every other member of the body of Christ. So how do we take these principles and take this sound thinking principle and move it toward the home? Well, it demands us thinking about function, which is that part we've just talked about. We all have a role, we all have a place, and so we need to be concerned about each other at the church. How do we apply these things to our homes? How do we move toward taking these Christian spiritual principles, how to live out love in the confines of the church and as his body and as Christians, how do they also impact the direction of our homes? 2 key tenets are this, that when our concerns are God's concerns, when our focus is on God's will, then it'll likewise also cause us to be concerned, be dwelling upon, be thinking about the needs of those in our homes with us. The more we dwell upon the mercies of God, the more we'll be drawn nearer to our families and our homes in those mercies. And then this final principle of being aware of the body of Christ and how everybody is different, yet everybody's a part of one. Think of how crucial that is to the family. Every person in a home and in a family has a different role, a different function, but everybody is a part of the one home, the one family. God brings us together because we're different so that we can give him that glory and that honor. So let's talk about a few of those specific roles quickly. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33 summarizes both the actions of the husband and the wife. That paragraph begins technically in verse 21. You find the main leading verbs, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, verse 21. And then verse 22, he begins with those instructions to the wives. And then he summarizes verse 33. You be sure, let each one of you, each man, love his wife as himself. And you followed along through the paragraph that precedes, it's especially tied to Christ. Now, Christ loved the church. Christ gave himself up for her. Christ nourished, presents her, washed her. So we are to nourish and to cherish, take care of our wives and take care of them as if we would ourselves. Christ sets the standard for how husbands are to lead. And notice carefully, Christ sacrifices, Christ gives, but Christ is not a spineless leader. Christ has backbone and does not do whatever the whims of the wife or the church in this instance just think he ought to do. Christ leads, but he leads with love and compassion and taking care of those under his care. And the responsibility of the wife is to submit, to respectfully submit, not because he's harsh and demeaning, but because she trusts God first and because she trusts the heart of her husband to lead. And as I said, we decided to study through this over a year ago, but talking about marriage and talking about husbands and wives is relevant in our culture because of some things that happened nationally the past couple of weeks up in Washington, D.C. I'm kind of saddened not just by what's happened, but also by how little news coverage this has gotten, at least kind of from my perspective, that the past couple of weeks, both bodies of the legislature have signed as a bill what they inaccurately call, the Respect for Marriage Act, which codifies same-sex marriage, meaning every state, no matter what your state's laws say, you have to respect another state's laws if someone moves in and wants to live there with that, quote, same-sex marriage, which is a contradiction of terms. But if that's going to happen, then you got to allow them to come in. Both bodies sign those bills. So it's expected to go, obviously, or it will go to President Biden, and it's expected that he will sign it. That means when he does sign it, all three branches of our government within the past 7 years will have legally said marriage is now also same-sex marriage. 7 years. Now, that's happened quickly. What's amazing about this is that 26 years ago, you had largely the Democrats, President Clinton was the face of this, signed and put into action the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which made same-sex marriage banned. You couldn't participate in same-sex marriage. And so the same people who fought to, quote, preserve it 26 years ago have now done a complete 180 to say, no, you have to allow it. We're going to force everybody to recognize it. Now, here's the thing, though. Here's how that happened. Even though that one side has flipped completely from being against it now for it, it only happened this past couple of weeks in both of these branches because of the compromise of those who claim to be conservative. That's the only reason that it happened. 12 senators who would have an R next to their name voted for this act. 39 in the House who would have an R next to their name voted for this act. Why did they do that? It's possible some of them are not up for re-election. They're going to ride off into the sunset, so they have less things to care about, and they just do what they want to do. It's possible that some of them think or have data that says their constituents want them to sign it, but I find that unlikely. Most likely, the reason is they've got a lot of pressure from different directions to vote, in this case for it, but they don't have a lot of pressure from the people that voted them into office that says this is how God designed marriage. And we're not going to support you if you support this. The pressure from the people has dropped enough to where they don't have a reason to stand up and to say, we're going to conserve something. So they would say still that they're conservative, yet they're not conserving the most fundamental building block of relationships in this country. And so we want a defense to these kind of things that keep happening in this downward spiral. Genesis 1 is a place to go, but Ephesians 5, verse 33 is a place to go too. The world needs to see not just a male and a female who are married, but they need to see a husband who loves like Christ and who would not only die for his wife, but who lives to serve her and to love her sacrificially every day. The world needs to see that. The world needs to see a wife who follows and who trusts and who submits, just as the church submits to Christ, living out God's plan for the roles and the functions of the home is our best defense against the world that tries to change and redefine marriage. But how does it relate to our role and our function as parents? We have a given responsibility, a summary. Ephesians 6:4. Not only don't hold them down, don't make them mad, but also be sure you're bringing them up actively in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. God is telling us in this passage that when the time comes for them to be an adult, the children to be an adult, when the time comes for them to answer to God before eternity begins or as eternity begins, there's only one thing that will matter that they have done. Do they know the Lord? have they been brought up and trained to know Him? The reverse, the reciprocal side of that, of course, is that children have a responsibility. Children, no matter how old you are, if you can understand this, you can know this. Your job, your role, your function, remember, we're thinking soberly about our function, is you're to learn to obey. We learn to obey while we're in the house, while we're at home. And if we fail to learn to obey, then it's an uphill battle for the rest of our lives. And we must have a positive view toward the discipline and instruction that yields that obedience. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, the moment all discipline seems painful, it hurts rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. The training process works by our parents giving us responsibility, and can we accept that responsibility with trust? If we show trust when given responsibility, then they give us more responsibility, more privilege, more trust, more responsibility, more trust, more responsibility. That's the training process. That's our function. If we think anything else is our purpose for breathing and getting our moms and our dads to do whatever, then we're missing God's designed function for us. Then we could go on, of course, about siblings or in-laws or grandparents. Every relationship is of value. But maybe there's a good connection here from James chapter 3 to remind us of an attitude that we all need, no matter our relationship. The wisdom from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial, and sincere. A harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the idea here is that no matter my connection, no matter my relationship, am I approaching it? And this can be challenging. In-laws and grandparents and all those things begin to add on some layers. Will I approach it first from God, right? Upward focus, mercies of God. Wisdom from above has these perspectives. Well, let these things draw me closer and closer to my family and serving them and loving them in the ways that God would have me to. So just think quickly, practically, what would change in my home when I begin to think myself with sound judgment? When I have an upward perspective that leads me to take personal responsibility inwardly, that thinks forward, that recognizes we all have a function, we all have a place, but we're all a part of one whole. What things would begin to change in the home when I begin to live from the mercies of God? And then one step further, what would change in this church? What would change in the parish community? What would change in Walker County? What would change in Jasper? When out of our personal transformation comes transformed homes, and then how do those homes then begin to impact the communities around us? Last night, just kind of stopped on a channel on the TV where The Incredibles movie was playing, and it's impossible to recommend any kind of Disney movie now, but this was from 2004, and every time I watch it or have it on, I just remember, hey, this is one of my favorites, and I keep forgetting about it because it's a very family-first movie, and especially about the point we've been talking about this morning. That is that every member of the family is a vital, necessary member of the family. And they're about to involve themselves in some turmoil, some strife. They're all superheroes. And they're on the airplane, and they're about to crash, and the mom looks at the two children, and she says, your identity is your most valuable possession. Protect it. And if anything goes wrong, use your powers. See, she had told them before, don't use your powers, don't blow the cover that we're superheroes. But now she's saying, you're under attack. The bad guys won't take sympathy for you just because you're a child, so use your powers. Protect your identity and use what you've been given. So listen, the devil, our spiritual enemy, he has no sympathy whatsoever. He does not care to come into our homes and destroy them from the inside out. In fact, he's trying to. So protect your identity. Know that God establishes and sets your identity. The mercies of God. Give yourself as a living sacrifice because of what all He has done and is doing for you. And also, use your powers. Use what you have. Use who you are. Use your function as the leader of the home as a dad. Use your function and role as a mom, as a wife. Use your role as a child, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, in-laws. Use those for the glory of God. Pull from the mercies of God and look forward in transformation to the future. So this morning, are you living in and out of the mercies of God? If you cannot say that you are, if you know that you're not, if you've rejected those mercies, choose today for that to end. Decide right now to put them on in baptism, to be immersed into water for the forgiveness of your sins. We'd love to assist you with that. If you know you need to come back to Him, you've not been living out of those mercies of God, then you can make your life right with Him. He promises to forgive you, and we promise to be here for you and help you however we can. Please know this time is for you. Would you come now as we